First on the agenda, we have JON ERIK DØLVIK from Fafo, who is, I guess, head of research. Is that the correct term to say? At least coordinator on the research on these policy issues. And he's going to start out by introducing Fafo's work on the future of work. I was going to say, without further ado, let's get JON ERIK up here. He's going to shortly present his thoughts, and then the rest of his great team is going to come up. I'll present them individually, and then we're going to have an interactive talk with you guys later on. But please give JON ERIK a hand.
Thanks a lot. The future of work, no less, no more. I think to understand and handle the future, we have to look at the present and the past. And the most standing out experience in the present was yesterday evening's experience we had at the soccer pub close by here, when we saw the heroic and very forceful Swedish team beat Italy, following Iceland, and tonight probably the Danes will beat the Irelanders and follow. And I think, speaking about what the future of work may mean to the Nordic model, this famous Nordic triangle model we have spoken a lot about in these circles, I think what we saw last night was how far you can come if you are well coordinated, work collectively, and can mobilize at defining moments. And I think that's been the strength of the Nordic models ever since they were not invented, because they have been changing and adapting throughout history to changing challenges and have undergone constant adaptation and adjustment. But some things have been very stable, and I'll come back to that. So, emphasis on opportunities and challenges. How will the changes the coming 10, 15, 20 years affect Nordic working life and the institutions on which it has previously built? That's the issue we have been asked by the Nordic Council of Ministers to organize a project around for the coming 4 years. We were, I would say, extremely happy and proud when we won this contest. We have worked on the Nordic models for SAMAK. Some of you may be familiar with that, the Nordic social democratic parties and main blue-collar confederations of trade unions, where we looked on all aspects of the social, economic, and welfare challenges and developments of these models. You can find a lot about that. But in 2013 and 14, all these, I wouldn't say hype, but all these attention to digitalization and robotization was actually not that strongly on the agenda. We wrote a little bit about it, but together, as Torsten said, together with a lot of other meta trends and challenges. And that's, I think, where we are heading now. Again, after a period of extreme hype, things are coming down to the ground, realities, and we need to sort out what is actually new, what is really transformative, and what is kind of within the continuous restructuring and adaptation that the Nordic models have been specialized upon fostering and enabling. So this is a project where we'll try to keep track of things. It's not really basic research. From the Nordic Council of Ministers side, it's definitely linked to the ILO process, the future of work process we heard about this morning, where I think this project is supposed to help Nordic policymakers to provide Nordic input, lessons, experiences to that process. And that, of course, is also exciting for researchers who like to be in contact with users, to learn from what the users who are on the ball can report. We are also very happy that this is not a single institute project. It's a common Nordic collective effort. Building on many of the research contacts we were lucky to build up through this NordMod 2030 project, we have a Nordic team from all 5 countries of roughly 25 researchers. They are listed here, broad range of researchers, experts, including Anna, whom you have met. And it's supposed to be comparative, it's supposed to be action-oriented, based on close dialogue with policymakers, not big reports or journal articles level 2, but policy-relevant inputs to conferences, workshops, to social partners, and so on and so forth. It's headed by Fafo. You can find the website, which is in the making. I think this is not the most complete reference, but you'll find it from there, and we can send it to those of you who want to go further. Briefly about how the project is organized. It's divided into 7 pillars. And then you easily calculate that 7 pillars, 5 countries, 4 years is not that much resources when you think of it, even though it's a good sum of money for research. It's short-term kind of synthesizing of available knowledge and very much dependent on research the actual participants can bring with them into the project. Like Anna told about this morning, she has done a lot in Denmark, and we are doing things in Norway, and the Finns do in Finland. We bring it together, and through this project, we hope to make it accessible and relevant for Nordic policymakers. I didn't catch the name of this Italian Rome god, but he spoke about the crossing between the past and the future. And that's what it's all about. And we have to look, in the first project, on the main drivers. Then we have to look back to the present. It has to do with a lot of things: demography, migration, globalization, social change, more heterogeneous populations, inequality, where technology is only one of many factors. And not a determinant factor, but one conditional factor shaped by institutions, as it always has been. Pillar 2, Johan will speak about. I won't go into it. We have Anna is head of pillar on atypical work, self-employment. You heard about this morning. And KRISTIN is going to talk a little bit more about platform work and platform management of work. And the question is, of course, what are the consequences for the content of work, of labor relations, the Nordic model, collective bargaining, and the implications for regulation of not only working life, but also welfare benefits, and what does it mean to taxation and macro policies in terms of providing revenue for these welfare states. A lot of challenges, but also a lot of continuity. That's what it's about, the first pillars. Then we have 3 pillars which are supposed to be more strategic, policy-oriented, transversal, picking up the findings in the first 4, looking on occupational health. We have the best Nordic institutes, specialists on public occupational health and work environment policies, which of course, if you work with a robot, it's new challenges coming up. How do you communicate and stand the reactions of the robot and so on? The interpersonal work environment will be somewhat different, or could be. Labor law, mentioned this morning. We have some of the best Nordic young aspiring labor lawyers in a team supposed to look at what are the needs actually for refining, adjusting, clarifying legal questions. And then in 2020, we are supposed to deliver the big synthetic report about what we see mean for the Nordic model as we used to know it. What kind of changes are feasible, necessary, What conditions have to be in place for the actors to respond and find ways to resolve these questions? How will the interplay between organized actors, the markets, and the state have to change or develop? So that's basically what the project is about. You can find on the slides who are participating in the different things. You can probably not read that, but by these words, I leave the floor to Johan and say thank you for the attention, and please ask questions when we are finished. Huh?
Excellent. Give JON ERIK a hand. Very interesting. And now on the stage we have JOHAN RØED STEEN. I don't know if that's correctly pronounced. I tried to be a bit Nordic. Also from Fafo, a researcher there that's going to take us through some more detailed studies on this subject. So please take it away.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. I have been... What?
You can go to your next slide.
Oh yes, of course. Okay. There we go. That's the title. It's great to be here. I've been nervous about it for weeks because I'm human and not a robot. It's obviously inefficient. We should have an algorithm picking up on some recent research and then have it read our project proposal to you, and we would save a lot of time and money. But I doubt that's the future of work. Luckily, some human interactions are still valued, and it's important for learning and networking and for quality of life, frankly. But still, it's a fact that most jobs will be affected by increasing digitalization, and many jobs are threatened as such by increasing automation. So in the following, I will take a bit of a closer look at the digitalization that will hit the existing form of working life, and I'll save the gig economy and related issues for later. And the thought is to present a little bit about some of the issues that we will grapple with in this project. Now, this we haven't started yet, so it's very preliminary. But the thought is to present sort of pillar 2. And one sort of defining theme is that we always hear that half or 1 out of 3 of Nordic employees will lose their job to robots in a decade or 2. Now the sort of good news from research is that we don't really know that, and it might be really overstated. And the good news is that the Nordic models seem very well equipped to handle it should it come true. The less good news is probably that there is a serious debate about whether it really could be different this time and about the implications of this. Rising inequality and polarization of the labor market seems to be of the most likely outcomes of this process. I thought I would speak a little bit about the driving forces of this and the robotization and the technology behind it, but you're probably tired of that by now, so I'll skip right ahead. But the gist of it is that these are some of the technological revolutions that seems to be coming our way, and what this means is that we are approaching a point where computing technology can spill over from having revolutionized the speed of communication and the access to information to a point where it can now revolutionize almost all industries and services more or less at the same time, which has been described as a dozen Gutenberg moments at once, which could have detrimental impacts for the labor market and working life as we know it. But there's also good reason for trade unions to be somewhat positive about this development, because it does give you some opportunities. First and foremost, of course, it provides opportunities for innovation and for productivity growth, which could be translated into increased wages given the sufficient bargaining power, of course. And this impact is not that easy to estimate, but it has been argued that it has the potential to double economic growth by 2035, and indeed this seems to be happening at some point already. The European Commission has estimated that something like 30% of EU GDP growth in the decade from 2001 was due to digitalization. And of course there are other potential benefits if this is governed right. including safer and better working tasks, sustainability, better work-life balance, but this is of course contingent upon trade unions and other actors governing this in the right way. But onto the defining question of the debates. Will the robots steal our jobs? Or in other words, will the jobs disappear on such a scale that we must reconsider our whole approach to the very concept of work and take up other activities and rely on universal basic income? And the answer is no. At least not in the short to medium term. That's relevant for policy and trade union strategies. Some projections from tech optimists have said that it will, but these usually seem to contain somewhat of an overdose of technological optimism and some determinism, and they usually seem to lack sort of a deeper understanding of the social and economic context which these developments are contingent upon and slowed down by. But some of these projections are more convincing than others. And I'm sure you've seen some of these numbers here before. Now the point is not to do what was stated earlier today that we shouldn't do, which is fretting about getting the numbers right, but the point here is sort of knowing when you've probably got the numbers wrong. These numbers have been hugely influential because mainly it looks very scientific and precise, and you can go into these studies and you can look up your own profession and find a precise number of, or percentage for how likely it is that that job will be automated. And that seems very appealing, but what these studies, and especially Frey and Osborne, which is the most cited one, have actually done is that they've asked a panel of experts at Oxford, I believe it was in 2012, which is an eternity by now in this context. And they've coupled their sort of estimates and guesses for a number of working tasks with descriptions of jobs, and then they've come up with a probability that this one occupation can be automated. And they've done this for 70 or so professions, and then they've generalized that into labor statistics, and then they come up with a number. And that's obviously a very subjective and quite non-transparent estimate, but it looks really, really impressive if you read the paper. Now the percentages for the Nordic countries here, which you've probably also heard, are based on the exact same study. The only thing they've done is basically they have taken the results and they have applied it to Nordic labor market statistics. Then you come up with this number. And the reason, well, an interesting thing is that it looks like the Nordic countries are probably better off, mainly because we have a higher amount of high-skilled workers. Now Sweden comes out a little bit higher because of the amount in manufacturing. Now these studies follow an occupation-based approach. And the OECD has said that this might lead to an overestimation because occupations labeled as high risk still contains a lot of tasks that are not easily automatable. And with this one sort of, this is really the only substantial change that's made in this study, and then the estimation falls to 10%, or 9%, or 7% for Sweden and Finland. And that's just, the reason why I'm speaking about the methodology here is not that the number is so important, but the point is that these studies, especially Frey and Osborne study, are extremely influential. Not only are they extensively referred to by a lot of individuals and also organizations, often as facts. And it's, I think it's important for trade unions to be aware that these are part of a powerful discourse which says that tumultuous change must follow from technological advancement. And this is relevant because it's frequently used as leverage in restructuring processes, or to argue for more flexible working arrangements, or the need to work harder and smarter and faster. An example from Germany was mentioned earlier today with employers wanting to limit the co-determination. Another example from Norway is that the CEO of the biggest bank said very publicly that there are now 10,000 employees. In 5 years, it will be amazing if we're 5,000, It will be a miracle if we're still 5,000 in 10 years. Now, he might be right, but that's a very convenient argument if they want to restructure for other purposes. Now, sort of the different camp in this debate is arguing that, not that nothing will happen, but they argue that jobs lost to automation will likely be more than compensated by growth elsewhere in the economy. And this is basically the ATM and bank teller argument that Deborah presented earlier today. David Otter at MIT is probably the most prominent economist at this side of the debate, and he argues that history provides us with ample information that automation has not wiped out the majority of jobs. It does indeed substitute labor sometimes, because that's the intention, but a lot of times it is also complementary to labor. It raises the economic output, it increases wealth, and then it leads to higher demand for labor and more jobs. And this Deloitte report here sort of underpins that argument, and they've looked at data from Great Britain from 1871 until today, and they draw a pretty broad conclusion that technological changes which enable substitution of labor with machines at every instance has in total contributed to more growth than jobs. Now, a related argument is that the predicted job destruction rates that were referred to earlier they're not really that unprecedented. The Nordic economies seem to be very well equipped to handle fast and sudden changes in sectoral unemployment. We've already demonstrated that before with the transition from employment in industries and services. An example is that the rate of job destruction and job creation within sectors is already much higher than this. For instance, 41% of Norwegians have been unemployed at some time in the past 10 years, despite a very low unemployment rate. But still, if we accept the notion that we won't have massive technology-driven unemployment at the next moment, there's still real empirical consequences to be observed. And that's one of the aims of this pillar. One main empirical finding is that the share of employment in occupations found on both ends of the skills and wage distribution, that's high and low, seems to be growing, while the share in the middle is declining. And one explanation for this, given by the already mentioned David Otter, is that the new technology supports high-skill cognitive tasks while it replaces low-skill routine tasks. And the lower-paid manual non-routine tasks are not affected unless they grow. And we can find similar tendencies in the European Union. And also, this was skills and this is wages. And you can see the same development here. Now, for the Nordic countries, it's less clear. Some recent research show polarization in Sweden, while another found upgrading in Sweden and polarization in Denmark. In Norway, the most available data indicates that there's still upgrading going on. But this will, with this as a background, this pillar will try to analyze the changes in occupational structure in the Nordic countries in a bit more detail. We will look at how this is, well, the main drivers of this, how it comes about, and to what extent digitalization is behind them, or if we can find other factors that explains this. Other key questions will be the changes that affect wages of different groups, social mobility, and inequality. Now, the Nordic models have always been dependent on relatively high levels of skill, but this seems to be gaining importance with digitalization. And we can find evidence of what's called skill-biased technological change, which basically shows that when new technology is introduced, the highest skilled workers get increased wages. Now, the theory is that new technologies are complementary with skilled labor, at least in the beginning when you have to figure out how to do it. And from this perspective, education and training could give us continued upgrading of the labor force. So governments, employers, and trade unions seem to be more and more aware of this, and it's a growing realization that competence might be the key to ensuring employment in digital economy. Sorry, I'm a bit
human.
I was going to say sore-throated, but thank you. Now, skills acquired through the educational system are obviously central here, but perhaps equally as crucial are the skills that are acquired through work itself and through continued training and vocational education. Fortunately, the Nordic countries are relatively well situated here as well. You can see Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Finland all in the top 5 here. This is the OECD survey of adult skills. But as Anna said before lunch, this is also a lot has a lot to do with also not only those who might lose their job, but also those who will have their job changed and will well, next here. Sorry, my notes are a mess. Anyways, the point here is that all in all, the Nordic countries seems to be very well set up to deal with digitalization, and for a long time they've prevented the development of a low-paid sector. They've been renowned to follow the high road to full employment, following the ren miner model. And one driver behind this success has been the highly coordinated wage setting, and it results in an egalitarian wage structure, as you know, which forces companies to achieve high productivity by adopting the latest technological advances, and also to engage workers in innovation processes. Another part of this puzzle is, of course, the strong trade unions that demands rising real wages in line with productivity growth. Now, the social partners are obviously key in this model, and that's why they're also key in this project. In the Future Work project, we will investigate how main stakeholders perceive the threats and potentials of digitalization, and also how they respond. And we'll look at how they draw on cooperative traditions of the Nordic model, also at company level. And it will also be a priority to discuss how the Nordic countries can learn from each other, coping with these changes. So this shows once again that we are quite well positioned. Here Norway is taken as an example for how we are placed in the digital economy. This is the Digital Economy and Societal Index. It shows digital public services, connectivity, human capital, use of internet, and integration of digital technology. And as you can see, Norway is above average on all these parameters, which also goes for Denmark, Sweden, Finland, and well, yeah, that's all that's in this graph. And the reason why I showed Norway by themselves is that we're, as usual, not included. Now, last but not least, I want to round out saying that I want to stress that politics and institutions will matter, and it will also matter in our research. The strategies of trade unions matter. Now, digitalization is not given. It's not a given journey from A to B, and it does not have implications that you can read all about in an American magazine and then have to come to terms with. On the contrary, the impacts will vary with multiple factors, and here are some of them. The first, education and training, I've already stressed, that's crucial. Now, efficient legislation and taxation, protecting workers' rights and securing funding for the welfare state is perhaps as important. I haven't really touched on that here, but both national and international efforts will absolutely be necessary if we're going to prevent the winner-takes-all logic of the digital economy. The big five is one example of that: Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Facebook, who, as we've seen in the latest Paradise papers leaked, aren't exactly contributing their fair share at the moment. Bargaining power, both local and central level, will obviously be necessary to convert productivity gains into wage increases, and also to withstand the worst Tayloristic impulses that's being enabled by the digital technology. Union density and bargaining coverage are, of course, important in bringing that about. Inequality in wage structure is, as I've touched upon, quite important because economies with low inequality seem better equipped to achieve further upgrading and to avoid the polarization or de-skilling that we're afraid of. Political influence is obviously really important for groups affected by this development because it touches all of the above mentioned factors. Now last but probably not least, social partner initiatives and cooperation, both formal and practical, will be able to shape the way digitalization actually happens in the workplace, and also it can tell us how to deal with it as a society. A broad social dialogue on the future of work is probably possible and will have beneficial effects, as we have seen from German and Swedish experience so far. And in the Future of Work project, we'll try and do our little part to involve the social partners and prepare the grounds for further dialogue on this. And with that, I'm giving the floor to KRISTIN to talk a little bit about digitalization and new forms of work.
Fantastic. Give him a hand. Thank you for an interesting presentation, Johan. All right, KRISTIN, take it away.
Thank you very much. First of all, can you all stand up?
Yes.
And now you can sit down again. Now I know you're all listening to me and you're awake and we can continue.
Bravo.
New forms of non-standard work have emerged with digitalization. In the Future Work projects, we treat platform work as an example of automation of the employer function. And in this way, the platform economy fits into the broader trend of digitalization. Platforms take advantage of new technology to match demand and supply of small tasks. Platform work is still marginal in the Nordic countries, but it might grow. This depends, of course, much on the regulatory responses of governments and social partners. But if platform work takes off, it might have significant implications for the Nordic labor markets, particularly because it adds to the broader trend of non-standard forms of work. These are some of the issues we will explore in the Future Work projects. And in this presentation, I will further elaborate our ideas on the following 3 points. First, the platform economy is an example of automation of the employer function. Second, it is still a marginal phenomenon, but it has the potential for growth. Third, I will elaborate on how platform work fits into the broader trend of non-standard forms of work. The platform economy is an example of automation of the employer function. Often, the platforms use data and set up algorithms to match demand and supply of short-term labor, also called gigs. In an article from 2015, Lee and co-authors describe how the ride-sharing apps Uber and Lyft use data and algorithms in the work process and management. They entitle this business model as algorithmic management. And Fredrik Söderqvist and Sig Silberman briefly talked about this earlier this morning as well. So data from user registration, customer ratings, and GPS are used in algorithms to match consumers and suppliers of labor, partly replacing the traditional management function. And in a way, you can see algorithms as an employer function. In his upcoming book, Humans as a Service, The Promise and Perils of Work in the Gig Economy, Prassel emphasizes that algorithms as a management tool have both positive and negative implications. On the one hand, this can lead to an improved matching between supply, demand, and expertise. On the other hand, this can have enormous consequences for the social and economic importance of work as we know it, as well as for the workplace. But platform work is still marginal in the Nordic countries. New research on the scope of platform work has emerged from Sweden, Denmark, and Norway, not yet from Finland or Iceland. In Sweden, a survey presented as part of the Swedish Committee on Working Environments Regulations finds that 2.5% Swedes aged from 16 to 64 performed work through digital platforms in 2016. The survey also indicates that this type of work is sporadic, and for most people, it constitutes a very small part of the total income. Similar results are emerging from Denmark, and this morning Anna Ilsø presented their report on experiences with digitalization and digital platforms among the Danish labor force. And the results indicate that about 1% of the Danish labor force has earned money through labor platforms. And later this month, Fafo will publish a report on the platform economy in Norway, where we estimate that the amount of people working through platforms is even lower than in the other Nordic countries. In the report, we also discuss the challenges on how to measure this new form of work. So we all encourage you all to read the report when it is published. And while platform work is marginal, several studies suggest that it might grow. And this depends partly on the regulative responses of governments and social partners. Let's take the case of Uber Pop as an example. Uber is a case in point where the governments of Denmark and Sweden have enforced traditional transport regulations on the company. This is not the case in Finland or Norway. In Finland, the government will deregulate the transport sector to accommodate for Uber Pop. In Norway, the government has still not responded to a committee's proposal in February 2017 to deregulate the transport sector. Although Uber is a special case, it may seem as the Nordic governments adapt somewhat different strategies in meeting the platform companies. And it will be interesting to follow these developments through the future work project and to see if this tendency continues or not. So what about the social partners? First of all, if the employer becomes an app, it might be challenging to negotiate collective agreements. Second, for trade unions, it is a dilemma whether they shall embrace platform workers and try to organize them, or rather protect their core group of members. But we also know that trade unions in the past have struggled in their attempts to organize workers in non-standard work arrangements. And many of the other speakers today have touched upon trade union strategies. On the employer side, there have already been a few conflicts of interest between branches, particularly in the hotel and transport sector. But for the employers, there is also a question of whether they manage to organize the platform companies at all. In the future work project, we will study the ways in which governments and social partners in the Nordic countries respond to platform work, as well as other new forms of work. Because platform work in itself is perhaps not the biggest threat to the Nordic labor models, but it plays into the broader trend of non-standard forms of work. Non-standard work, defined as employment contracts other than full-time open-ended positions, has become more widespread in parts of the Nordic labor market since the global financial crisis. Yet, there is a great variety of types of non-standard forms of work, and we know little about the extent to which people choose such work, or if it's out of necessity. In Finland, the incidence of self-employed without employees is comparably higher than in the other Nordic countries. The Finnish Bureau of Statistics has studied whether work as a self-employed without employees is necessity-based or opportunity-driven. The results indicate that there is a mix, but about 30% is considered to be necessity-based, or forced self-employment, as they call it. But more knowledge is needed on the motives and working conditions of those in new forms of non-standard work arrangements, and this is one of the issues we will explore in the future work projects, as well as how these emerging forms of non-standard work might affect the Nordic labor models. So stay tuned, and thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for that very, very interesting and concise presentation. So if all of you would please come back up on stage. Now is the time to get the audience involved. And we have approximately 20 minutes before we need to get back. So this is very good. So first of all, while you guys think of some good questions, I will start 6 because I have the microphone, so I can take the privilege to start. No, KRISTIN, I think it was super interesting. This I think you put it as the platforms as an automation of the employer role, and I think that's a quite interesting way of putting it. At least in our last session out there, we had a discussion about, well, what about this discussion about whether or not these guys are they self-employed or are they not, and on the platforms, are they just an intermediator, and how do we find out whether or not these guys are entitled to the protections that the employer, that the employee status gives them? So perhaps you could just elaborate, like, very quickly on how you see that and the enforcement.
Yeah, my take on this is that the platforms, they set up the algorithms. It's not something that is done automatically, so they decide what data they are taking in on the platform through user registrations, GPS, and how they collect data. They decide what to collect, and they also decide how to set up the algorithm so that some people get the job or other people don't get the job. So I think that this, yes, this should be treated as a management function. But we haven't seen any cases in the courts where this is tested yet, where it's tested if people are employees or self-employed. But I think labor courts should try to maybe look at new criteria, such as this, the algorithm function.
And we might have some interesting problems in the Nordics with this, because a lot of that is required of the unions or other people to take that to the courts. So, but now, guys, let's have you guys involved now. And as JON ERIK presented there, this is like a very broad workshop. Still, we had a very interesting presentation on automation. And I was tweeting while you made your presentation, and I perhaps tuned it up a notch and said that Fafo is saying that the robo dystopia is a hoax, and so perhaps you might not entirely agree of that way of putting it, but I think that was quite interesting to see some of the more recent studies on that is more some specific task that will be automated. And the interesting question is, how do we actually go about this? So questions for both automation and platforms are encouraged. And please state your name and where you're from.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. My name is Thorin Bjrnsson. I'm from the Ministry of Employment in Sweden. I think one of you said that automation has always meant progress, and that we sort of expect that we'll have progress also now. I mean, we know now that the industrialization meant progress and higher incomes, but at that time, back in the 19th century, people didn't know that. So when the Luddites destroyed the machines, they were protesting against being out of job and probably ending up into poverty. And even if we have progress, we know that some groups will be left aside, and people will be affected in very different ways. So how do we compensate the losers, and how do we make sure that the winners, that everyone contributes? I think is my short question to a long presentation. Yeah.
Okay, before you answer that, guys, let's see if there are a few short questions so we can try to get as much involvement as possible. Anna.
Thank you. Johan, I have a question for you. You addressed some of the differences between the Nordic countries on polarization. I think that's really interesting because often we talk about the similarities between the Nordic countries. So could you elaborate on these differences in the polarization tendencies among the Nordic countries, and perhaps also why? Different crisis responses and so on. Yeah.
I can probably
Excellent.
I can probably start with that because I can't. That's on my part. That's one of the goals of doing this project, because I haven't done any of my own research on that. I've just sort of read the available studies. So I don't know if anyone else are able to help out to really elaborate on that. But that's
well, I think if you look at the European Foundation report on occupational restructuring, one hint at the reasons for variety is that they decompose job losses and job growth according to skill and wage levels over a longer period of time, crossing it with economic cycles. And the Nordic countries have gone through, over the past 10, 15 years, very diverse cyclical developments. Finland and Denmark has been through a long slump, even though it's not that much talked about, at least in one of the countries, while Sweden has been booming. And Norway has also, apart from the few past 2 years, been through an extreme bonanza. And of course, when you have very strong demand for labor, the conditions for upgrading are much more beneficial than when you have a shrinking labor market, as you had in Finland and Denmark for 6, 7 years. Or not, perhaps not that much, but to make the point, how the restructuring between sectors and occupations evolve over shorter periods of time depend a lot on these crises and booms. So we have to take a longer view. But I think in the longer term, I think there is good evidence that you see this imminent tendency or underlying tendency of polarization. But in some instances, like in the Norwegian case, the growth even in the middle have been enough not to have a reduction of middle-skilled jobs, but there are a lot of counteracting tendencies. So if you look at specific occupations and see who has been growing and who has been declining in terms of their relative share of employment, you see much of the same. So I think that's about the best we can say, but you can't ignore that tendency.
Excellent. Just a quick interesting point on that. I remember a figure in a report from McKinsey from this spring where they focused on the case of Denmark, where they elaborated on this automation report. There's a very nice graph there that shows how a lot of jobs have been automated away or moved away from the agricultural sector and the industry, and you see correspondingly a very big increase in public sector jobs on the other side. So I think it's a quite interesting representation of if you have a well-functioning tax system or redistributive system, and through collective agreements, you can actually move these jobs some other where you democratically want them to be, actually. Hanna.
Yes, thank you. My name is Hrannar. I come from Social Democrats in the Nordic Council. I agree to this assumption that if you look back to the history, we will probably find solution on how we can find new jobs for all the people that digitalization get out of job, if you can say so. There will come some new opportunities, I think. And I'm also pretty sure that we in the Nordic countries will find some solution to organize the things within the platform economy that is bound within our boundaries, within the Nordic countries. But as I see it, we can organize that in some way. But as I see it, and we discussed it here in the session before, then we are facing a global change. This is a global phenomenon we are discussing, and there will we find the problems. There will we find the problems by with organizing people, and there we will also find the problems of taxation and some regularities. And if we combine that with the main issue we are discussing, and we heard in the starting debate, it is inequality. It's about how we can see to that the dividend of this process will not end with the richest countries in the Nordic countries, for example. As I see it, we, the Nordic countries, and we are always discussing about how we are going to protect the Nordic model. How are we going to give away some of our privileges to make this happen in the most fair way? Because we have to look at it that way also. We can't close our fortresses and keep on trying to defend the Nordic model if the case is really should be how we're going to build a global model who work for us all, and see to that we can use this new technology to give away the dividend of it all over the world. Shouldn't that be the question we are, shouldn't that be the model we are looking for? The global model, not the Nordic model.
Good question. So what are we going to do about the Bangladeshi platform workers, selling their expertise to people in Oslo or wherever? That's a good question. Do we have another question before we let the Fafo follow up on that? Yes, we have here.
Hi, my name is Thorin. I come from Iceland, from BHM, which I'm sure all of you have heard about. It's the Akademikerne in Iceland. I would like to ask Johan to elaborate a little bit about what he said about technological optimism or determinism, and also because I've been to a few conferences this year, where predictions of job loss, those you mentioned, have been just bandied about. And everyone is describing the fourth technological revolution, and that your job will not exist in 10 years or 20 years or something like that. And no one is really doing anything about it, except for the researchers, of course. And so what I would like to have maybe you elaborate on is how do we use facts to create foresight when it comes to policy making? That's sort of the business you are in, gathering the facts, and then some of us in here take part in policy making, but mostly it's other people who are not here. So it's also about informed discussions, an informed dialogue about what is the fourth industrial revolution. Because I find that we are very much victims to the digitalization of information, in that everyone has a little bit of information, such as about the job loss, but nobody really knows what it means. So how do we get it out there? It's a simple question.
Very simple question. Okay, guys, let's hear your answers to the two questions.
I can start with a third question that I left long ago about the Luddites.
That's not the rule of the game.
No, but I feel rude not answering it. Well, to start with, the Luddites were not wrong. I mean, they did lose their jobs, and it did cost them a lot, and they lost out. They were wrong on a societal level. That's different, and that's the same now, because we will have groups negatively affected by this, and it will drive inequality in some ways. And this has even been used to explain why President Trump won the election in the US, because of the disenfranchised workers that were either competed out by globalization or automated. The factories they worked in were automated. And the question about how we address it, well, that's very broad, and I think the answer is very broad as well. And in the simplest sense, it's the Nordic welfare states. More specifically, it's unemployment benefits. It's probably also education and re-education on a higher level than today, maybe better financed, maybe by tripartite or social partner initiatives. And I think it's also really crucial to put together an educational system that makes it possible to actually reinvest in competence if you need to transfer from one industry to another, and that becomes increasingly important if digitalization will hit entire occupational groups. Say, if we get self-driving cars, then we will have a lot of drivers with one professional skill that's no longer needed. Then we need probably a lot more than we have today in terms of measures.
I didn't hear an answer to the whole inequality as in on a global scale level, or perhaps more a question of solidarity, perhaps.
No,
JON ERIK.
Well, this has been an issue around as long as I can remember. Words like imperialism, internationalization, and globalization, and European integration has been on the agenda. And of course, there's no simple, quick fix answer to that. But the question was posed in the way like, why should we protect the Nordic model, supposing that there was a contradiction between keeping inequality low within the Nordic boundaries and finding transnational ways of countering, let's say, tax escape and countering exploitation or abuse in production chains. And so I think we have to keep several lines of reasoning in head and act along very different dimensions here. I think for the Nordics, the line has always been to be open. We are small, open export economies. It would be ridiculous to try to protect the Nordic model by any kind of protectionist response. I mean, some of us are old enough to remember when the textile industry, the shoe industry, the shipyards went off to Asia or Southern Europe and so on and so forth. We didn't protect them, but we found new sources of employment. And I think, of course, there are, if we are seeing a global market of crowd work where intellectual, simple, routine tasks can be offshored to India or Bangladesh, well, those being in these companies in Norway doing this kind of work, well paid, may see a shrinkage of their labor market. Then they will need retraining and going into other occupations. And I think, so at the domestic scene, that's very much a matter of whether or how we manage to develop the social institutions that make people able to and willing to remain mobile and to adjust. But the big question of how do you curb global inequality, that we have to work on along many different things. But I think it's linked together with how do we compensate the losers, because I think a major threat to the Nordic systems is if the tax base is disappearing. Like the big fives, they are the hugest values on on the stock market. They literally only employ some 300,000–400,000 people. General Motors and the German car industries employed millions. That created a tax base. To resolve that question, the Nordic countries are totally dependent on transnational and supranational cooperation to close these holes, to tax these companies. It can't be solved in a Nordic way. It has to be solved on an international way. So that's only part of that's elements of the answers that we have to develop in common through this project by discussions like this.
Thank you for this, Jon Erik. Now we are running out of time. So if there is one super quick question, we will take that and we will let KRISTIN round out for us. Right? You had a comment before her.
Yeah.
All right.
Yes, thank you. Hello, I'm Hedvig Forselius from Unionen. You said that you will be looking into issues, labor law related issues, and also collective bargaining powers. Will you also be looking at things like the right to take collective actions in a future world of work where maybe it will be easier to find the employee but not as easy to find the employer? How do you strike against an algorithm, for example?
And are robots allowed to strike?
Thank you for that relevant question. KRISTIN, and I think that's a good cue to you, I guess.
Yeah, I just actually wanted to say something
please keep it
about
short.
this being a global phenomenon. Yes, I will be. Because we also have to look at how this evolves in the Nordic countries. And let's take Norway as an example. The biggest platform in Norway is actually Norwegian. It's called Finn Småjobber, and they have about 2,000 gig workers. And the second biggest is Uber Pop, which is now shut down, and they had around 1,000 gig workers. So, and we also see that some of the Norwegian platform companies that are establishing, they choose to take on the employer responsibility. So if we look at how this evolves in the Nordic countries, in Norway at least, it's a Norwegian phenomenon as well. They do it differently than the big international companies. I think we see a tendency of that. Yeah.
And this is a yes or no question. Are you going to look on collective actions on digital platforms?
Yes.
I'm sure. As a matter of labor law, yes.
So that was a yes. And the email addresses are up here.
Yep.
So you are able to follow up on this. But thank you so much to you, the patient audience and engaged audience, and especially to Fafo, the wonderful speakers. We look very much forward to see the results. Give them a hand.